let's start with the title of your novel, Apeirogon. I hope I pronounced that correctly to start.
Perfect. You can call it whatever you like. It's like my name, Colum, whatever you like. Apeirogon is a shape with a countably infinite number of sides. I think this is it was a startling word when I first stumbled upon it, and what it really means in relation to the story, which is about two men who lose their daughters. One is Palestinian, one is Israeli, and they travel around the world, sharing the story of what happened to their daughters in order to harness the power of their grief. What Apeirogon means in this particular situation is that we're all involved. We're all complicit in a certain way. We're all touched by it. We're all moved by it, and we're all somehow we are part of every story. So that this whole idea that one story is sort of every story in a way, and we're intimately connected. And these two men, Bassam Aramin and Rami Elhanan, are part of the Apeirogon, and so the story spins out in several different directions, and it always comes back to the two girls, Smadar, who was 14 or 13 when she died, and Abir, who was 10 when she died. Smadar died in a suicide bombing in Jerusalem, and Abir died from a rubber bullet in the back of the head when she was 10 years old. And these two fathers came together, and for years and years now they have been traveling the West Bank, Israel, around the world. They've been here in England, they've been in Northern Ireland, they've been to Sweden, they've been to the States, trying to tell the story in order to say, as they would say in Arabic, halas, enough. And it's time for us to know one another. And if we don't tell our stories, then we won't know one another. And if we don't know one another, all this fear is going to come tumbling in upon us. And as Bassam says, he says, if we don't know each other above ground, the only place we will know each other is below ground. It was years ago when I met them. And I remember the moment I met them, and like all the oxygen was gone from the air. That was it. It was just, I kind of knew even the moment I met them that things were never quite going to be the same for me. I'd been 10 days in Israel and Palestine, and with a big group, musicians, activists. We were all, tough, whatever. We were going around. We'd seen some stuff. I'd seen Northern Ireland. I thought, I can get through all this. And then the second to last night, I go into the small room in Beit Jala. Two ordinary men are sitting there, and then they begin to speak, and then I realized these are not ordinary men. These are extraordinary people. And I started to, I suppose, like, it's a little embarrassing, but I started to weep. It still catches me now when I think about this, when they started talking, and I was there. Do you ever get the feeling that you're looking down on yourself, thinking, stop crying, you're really making a fool of yourself right now, and that's what I was thinking. And then they wrote out on these napkins for me afterwards. They wrote it like, harness the power of your grief, and I thought, okay. And I didn't know that I could ever write about them, but always I kept coming back to them. Months and months later, it's like, what do you want to write about? Well, I kind of want to write about that moment when everything sort of changed for me. So this is a sort of a hybrid novel. These men are real. And they'll be going on tour with me in certain places. They'll come to Dublin, for instance. These men are real, but also now they're characters. And for them to allow me the dignity to go in and rewrite some of the things about them, they were just incredibly generous. And I kept giving it to them. I kept going over actually to Israel and to Jerusalem and Jericho. And I would read them sections and say, "Is that all right?" And they say, "Yeah, that's all right." And but I'm not interested, and neither are they, in the absolute, the absoluteness, if that's a word, of facts. Facts are mercenary things. Facts can be used. They can be soldiers for whatever sort of truth that you want them to be. Facts and figures, texture, emotional texture, heart, That's a completely different thing, and that's what I was going for, to try to capture the emotions that they have and continue to have, not only in relation to their daughters, but an ordinary day. The novel's quite simple, really. A man wakes up one morning, drives a motorbike, goes to a monastery in the West Bank, meets his friend. They both tell their stories. The friend drives home and gets into bed and water. Oh, I won't give away the last image of the book, but it's simple and yet it's not simple. And then within that structure, everything occurs. So the big weird sections about birds flying and how to make bombs and boarheads walking through Jerusalem and water and molecules and whatever else. It's kind of like you try to put a whole world in there in order for us to try and understand that every story is a world. And it could be your neighbour across the street in Lancashire or London or Cork or whatever it happens to be. We have to start looking at one another and realise, wow, we're a lot more complex than our political parties seem to think that we should be. We're a lot more nuanced.
There are 1,001 chapters to the
That's right.
book. It counts up to 499.
That's right.
We have 2 chapters dedicated to each of the men and then a chapter in the middle, 1,001. When did that structure sort of suggest itself to you, and why was it important to write the book in this style? Because it's almost like a story which has been sort of exploded and sort of comes back together as you read it.
Well, thank you for noticing that and for seeing it that way. The structure sort of found me in a way. I've been talking to my students a lot. I said, okay, well, you've got to, why don't you write a novel for the internet age? And why did you write something about the way our minds work right now and all the weird shotgun leaps that we make from one image to the next? And as I began looking at this story, I'll be frank with you, I was confused. I was really confused about, and I knew nothing really about Israel and Palestine. I'd written a lot about Ireland, Northern Ireland, the peace process. And one of the things that I wanted to do was to embrace the confusion of it in order to destroy the confusions and tell the reader and tell myself it's okay to be confused about this. So the book doesn't labor to tell you this happened, this happened. It's really about the emotion of what's going on. And there are facts and figures and all sorts of like things going on. But one of my great days was when my son, who was 19 at the time, was reading my book for me, and he's 21 now, and he comes into my office and says, I get it now, Dad. He said, I was trying so hard to understand what was going on in Israel and Palestine. I said, now I'm just confused, and I'm so happy to be confused. And then he could read it and get to the human texture. So you don't become overly conscious. When you become so conscious about trying to work things out, it brings a sort of illness to where you happen to be, I think. But if you just allow it to happen and to wash over you, and you enter the story, and this is a fairly heartbreaking story. 2 fathers lose their girls. I mean, for any parent to lose a child is an extraordinary thing. In fact, so extraordinary that we don't really have a word in the English language, a noun, a proper noun. We have a widower, we have an orphan, we have all these things, but we don't have a word for a parent who has lost a child. It's either I think it's something so shocking that we don't want to put a language on it. And the important thing is, I believe that these men, when you meet them, and hopefully when you meet them in the pages of the book, they're full of the most extraordinary hope. So in the face of all the available evidence, along come these extraordinary human beings, and they say, well, we still believe in the power of stories. We are bringing our daughters back alive by telling them and talking about them, and we're also pleading with people, hey, no, let's try to understand one another. And fundamentally, it's a very simple message. I need to know you. You need to know me.